Welcome to my video of 10 board game mechanics that should be ripped off more. Now right off the bat I want to say that ripped off is a very powerful and negative term, and what I really should have gone with is something like 10 board game mechanics that I think should be used more and felt out more by designers. But I thought ripped off was a better title, so I'm going with that. Also, these entries are in no particular order, as I didn't want to have the idea that one mechanic was better or more interesting than another, and also, while I was making this video I thought of a few I should have included, but didn't as I'd already started. I'm looking at you, Kanban. So without further ado, starting off the list at number 10 is Great Western Trail, which I purposely put first because it is the newest game on the list. As of the timing of this recording, the game is only a few years old, and game design typically takes a while, so this one is the hardest to say that designers should have borrowed this mechanic by now. Anyway, the specific mechanic is adding spots to routes. Great Western Trail in a nutshell is a game about moving from the bottom right to the upper left, stopping at buildings along the way. During the game, you will build buildings on the routes, which will actually increase the number of spots it takes to travel along the route. I personally love the idea of choosing routes based on player-based incentivization. And these buildings do exactly that, by either adding tolls that you have to pay, or by simply just making the route longer, which makes it take more turns to get by. Any game with a race or route mechanic could potentially benefit from this mechanic. I really like the idea of routes becoming less desirable because they've become overcrowded or overused. Just not my routes, of course. Number 9 is Broom Service, or Witch's Brew, and the mechanic is the Brave Cowardly from Broom Service, or the I Am So Be It from Witch's Brew, both effectively the same thing, though only one has won the Kennish Spiel des Jahres. The way the mechanic works is, and I'm going to be focusing on Broom Service for this example, is that everyone picks 4 cards out of a set of 10. Then, whoever has control will play one of their cards. Let's say the Weather Fairy for this example. As they play the Weather Fairy, they must announce if they're taking the Brave action or the Cowardly action. The Brave action is the better of the two, but comes with risks as it might be taken away from you. The Cowardly action is worse, but can be done right away with no risk. Play passes clockwise to the left to the next player. The next player must reveal the Weather Fairy if they drafted it, or say pass if they did not. If they reveal a Weather Fairy, they must then choose to take the Brave or Cowardly action at that point. If they choose Cowardly, then they just take the Cowardly action, no muss, no fuss. But if they choose Brave, then they have sole ownership of the Brave action from then on. Remember how I said the first player may lose the Brave action? Well, this is how. Play now passes to the next player, who must also reveal the Weather Fairy if they have it and make the same decision, and so on around the table until everybody has had the chance to play the Weather Fairy. Whoever was the last person to take the Brave action then does so, and everyone else who took the Brave action gets nothing. I love this mechanic because it really forces you to pay attention to the other players, especially the players to your left and right. I also love some of the tension it brings, like when the next to last player is agonizing whether to take Brave or Cowardly, and trying to look at the last player to get some kind of tell as to whether they have the card or not. I feel like designers that are really good at point salads, like Stefan Feld, could really make some interesting variations on this mechanic. Maybe somehow a system where 2 players could double down that nobody else has that card, or maybe somehow if you set it up right, you're trying to lose the Brave action. I think the only game that has something like this that isn't named Witch's Brew or Broom Service is Glass Road. And that's too bad, because I think there's really a lot of potential with this mechanic. I'd also like to say that the Italian version of Witch's Brew is called Bippity Boppity Brew. I just thought that was really cute. Game number 8 is Almond Ray, and, well, let's be honest. You could take all of Reiner Knizi's games, throw a dart, hit one of them, and add that to a list like this. So I did, and the game I hit was Almond Ray. And the mechanic I like most in Almond Ray is the hard reset. So Almond Ray is an auction game where you auction off plots of land using a mechanic seen also in Stockpile and Vegas Showdown. Eventually, all the land is given out, and players have been building upgrades and other things on the land to score them points and get them more money. The first half of the game ends, and this is where the hard reset comes in. All ownership of the plots of land are removed, however, any improvements they put on the land remain. You then play the rest of the game just like the first half, and the game is over after the second half. I like this mechanic a lot because if instead of bidding on the same things every game, the values will change based on players' decisions. It also resets the game tactically, so if you're losing, you can make a comeback using tactics rather than trying to lash out in desperation from a worse position. I mostly want to see this mechanic in competitive legacy games, where with a hard reset you can adjust and adapt on the fly, rather than hope that the engine you built isn't screwed over by the inevitable system changes. Also, for the record, I know Almond Ray isn't a true hard reset. I wish it was. It would alleviate some of my problems with the game. And, well, anyway. Number 7 is the draft from Citadels, the best game about drafting cards and swinging randomly ever. This is a picture of the latest version, though most of you are probably familiar with this version. Anyway, the draft in this game is very simple. You simply take one card out of the hand and pass it to the player on your left. Then they take a card, pass it to their left, and so on until everyone has drafted a card. What truly makes this game shine though, however, are the Assassin and Thief cards. If you choose one of those cards, then on your turn, you will choose another roll to be hit by a powerful negative effect. However, since you're targeting a roll and not a player, you don't exactly know who's going to be affected by this. The only surefire way to avoid getting hit is to draft those cards. However, you'll be missing out on getting ahead with the bonuses on some of the other cards. This leads to a level of outguessing and outplaying that I just don't feel like I get from games that Citadels is often compared to, such as Libertalia and Mission Red Planet. The problems, though, with Citadel's draft are very obvious. While you're drafting and figuring things out, everyone else is staring at you. And if you are playing 7 players, then for 6 out of the 7 actions, you're just staring at other people. Also, if you're the last pick and you just have 2 cards to choose from, it's usually not very fun or interesting. I feel like a game where you can cut the number of drafts you do during the game to just a few times instead of every turn, as well as a game that incentivizes guessing and knowing what your opponents have chosen, could really benefit from this style of draft. Or maybe I'm thinking about it too hard and I should just play Not Alone, because that game is amazing. For number 6, I again threw a dart at Knizia's gaming catalog, and I landed on Raw. Raw blends push your luck and auctioning in a way that I haven't really seen in any other game, which is a shame because it's fantastic. And with the way the bidding works in Raw, you constantly have interesting decisions throughout the whole game. On top of all that, there's even a timer mechanism, which makes some decisions more valuable just due to sheer desperation. I feel I should note that while I still maintain that there's nothing quite like Raw, there are games that are similar and are each great in their own right. Games like Medici, Diamant, and Costa Rica all have a kind of similar system, and this is why I put Raw on the list. I feel like practically any game involving auctioning off lots could benefit from a little push your luck. You just gotta figure out how to put it in. Number 5 is Concordia, which I know everyone doesn't like it, but if you haven't played it, you really should. There are actually a number of mechanics I could have chosen for this list from Concordia, including the hand rondelle and the drafting of action cards, which also help focus your endgame victory points. But the thing I'm going to focus on is the diplomat card, which simply lets you copy another player's last action. It's an absurdly simple way to increase interaction, which you've probably figured out by now I really like, and it also adds interesting tactical possibilities. Now players will pay attention to other players' turns just so they know what potential targets they have to diplomat. Conversely, a player may hold on or delay a very powerful action just so that less opponents will be able to diplomat it. I feel like this mechanic has a lot of room for innovation as well. For example, this could be really interesting in a simultaneous action selection game where you try to guess what your opponents are going to play. Or perhaps a system where you're incentivized to get as many people to copy you as possible, as you're rewarded in some way for people doing that. And finally, copying this mechanic for another game just seems really appropriate for this list, doesn't it? Game number 4 is Dungeon Lords, and the mechanic is spot incentivization with simultaneous action selection. In a nutshell, what you do in Dungeon Lords is pick 3 cards out of 8, with each card depicting some resource you want to get. All cards are played face down, and then when all players have done this, each player reveals their first card and, in turn order, places their worker on the spot depicted. Players will then reveal and resolve their second and third card in the same manner, and after all the workers are placed, the spots on the board are all resolved. The trick is there's only 3 resource locations available at each resource spot, so if everybody chooses the same resource and you're the last player to go there, you get nothing. Furthermore, of the 3 resource locations available at each spot, the middle one is almost always the best. This forces players to really look at their opponent's intentions and guess what they're going to do, as you really want to time your actions to be after one player but before everybody else. I love the level of interaction and outguessing that this mechanic brings to the game. The I know what you're going to do, but I don't know when you're going to do it is such a fun effect. The harsh penalty of totally missing an action if you're last at the spot also adds some interesting dilemmas. Sometimes you gotta just throw a card out there as soon as possible and not worry about optimizing the action just because you need to do it and not get screwed. While that does make for great tension, this game is unbelievably harsh, and that can turn a lot of people off. Furthermore, the resolution of the game is a little bland because the theme is not very strong. I feel like a nicer version of this game, combined with a really strong theme, could be in contention for best game ever made. I'm serious. Game number 3 is Vikings, and the mechanic is the draft wheel. The core of this game is drafting Vikings of different colors, and you do this by arranging them in order by color around the wheel. Now, let's say there are 3 blue Vikings. You're going to put those first on the wheel because blue Vikings always go first. The wheel is also numbered by cost, so the first 3 blue Vikings will cost 1, 2, and 3 respectively. The trick here is that after the blue group has been bought, the wheel is going to rotate, so the next lowest colored group will now take up the lowest costing spots. I really think it's neat to have fluctuating prices that's essentially controlled by the players. It's really a nice feeling to have that thing you wanted drop right into your price range at just the right time. Furthermore, there's an interesting mechanic where if you buy the most expensive thing on the wheel, you get a bonus. This might encourage players to not buy the cheapest thing, so they don't rotate the wheel to make that bonus cheaper for the other players. I really think this wheel mechanic is ripe for offering incentives and different timings on buying things, which the players would have to consider. One of the main things that needs to be addressed, though, is player order. If a player is playing in such a way that creates an economic stranglehold, the player that gets most screwed by this is the player to their left. Some kind of player-controlled turn order would help with this, because now if you're in the worst spot, it's probably your fault. Anyway, I think a game with this mechanic could be the best game of all time. I'm not serious this time. Number 2 is King of Tokyo, or New York, with the mechanic of predetermined attacks. On your turn in this game, if you attack the monster in Tokyo, unless you happen to be the monster in Tokyo, in which case you attack everybody else. I cannot stress how this makes the acts of player aggression and player elimination that much more tolerable in this game. If you get attacked in this game, it's usually a result of your play or your bad luck, because let's face it, it's still a die rolling game. I think that any game involving direct interaction, aggression, or player elimination should strive to have something in place like King of Tokyo. While there is still the choice of whether to attack or not in King of Tokyo, for the most part, it's not the same as directly targeting someone and having that be the choice. I think an important part of this is predetermination. As soon as you start your turn, you know exactly who your attacks are going to hit, and there's no way to change it either. I would like to add that the mechanic I'm talking about here is not the same as predetermined goals. For example, some games give you a specific target for the whole game. If one player is lackluster at attacking, whether by choice or by player skill, then that gives an advantage to the player they're targeting, as they no longer have to worry about defense. I'm realizing that this is much more complicated to explain than I initially thought. So instead of going through all the examples and permutations, I'm just going to say play King of Tokyo, it's great. Number 1, 504. Yep. So yeah, 504 was a very creative and very ambitious project that had a few problems. The biggest of which is probably that, these days, there are 504 games that come out every year that are better than it. Still, the thing that I most liked about it was the rule flipbook changey thing. Clearly I don't know what it should be called. But I will admit that I did enjoy flipping through it and looking at it without playing it. I really don't know why it needs to be a flipbook because it never changes during the game, so it could have been done with just loose cards. Anyway, if you flip through the different permutations of the rules from the flipbook, you'll get 504 variations, which is why the game is called 504. I understand that making a successful version of 504 is practically impossible, but I really want some designers to try. Maybe not something so ambitious, maybe a game called like 27 or something. Or, and even better, a mechanic to change the rules mid-game that's player controlled. In my mind, this would be ridiculously hard to pull off well, but if someone could, Imagine the variety. I suppose this could be adapted so that each player just changes their own rules, but then that's not too far off from a tech tree. I know this entry is a bit vague, but if there's a designer out there that can capture the spirit of 504 in a great game, well, I want to see that happen. And that's my list. If you have any mechanics that you think should have been listed, please tell me in the comments below. Also, I feel I should note that I decided not to include two-player games on this list since I don't play them that much, and that's why Targi isn't there. That's the end of the list. Thank you for playing along.